Mary Mallon was a woman born in a small town in the province of Ulster in the north of Ireland in the late 1860s. Coming from a humble background in such an obscure place, she might have made little impression on the world in most instances. But this was not the case, for Mary Mallon became known all over the world for an unusual and controversial reason. This is her story. Mary Mallon was born to John and Catherine Mallon on the 23rd of September 1869 in the village of Cookstown in the county of Tyrone in the north of Ireland. She was born during an age of mass migration from Europe to the Americas and other regions such as Australia and New Zealand, as industrialization and rapidly improving public health saw the continent's population balloon in size. Some countries such as Ireland and Italy became completely unable to sustain their population levels, and millions of people left those two countries between the 1820s and the 1930s for countries such as the United States, Canada, Argentina, Brazil and Uruguay. Mallon was amongst them, leaving Cookstown in 1883 for New York City, where she went to live with her aunt when she was just 14 years of age. During her first years in New York, Mallon found work as a domestic servant and then later working in the kitchens of some of the city's upper middle class families. This was the Gilded Age of American history, when many families in New York built huge mansions and had brigades of household servants. Mallon did well in this environment, and by the mid-1890s, she was acquiring work regularly as a cook in the homes of many of Manhattan's wealthiest citizens. But Mallon is remembered today not for her cooking skills, but for the disease which he acquired at some point around 1900, and which he inadvertently began spreading around the homes of the rich in New York: typhoid fever. The disease which Mary Mallon would become infamously associated with, typhoid fever, is caused by Salmonella serotype typhi bacteria. It is caused by a bacterium and is generally passed through contact. Symptoms vary from being mild to severe, and usually begin about a week after contact. These include a general weakness and cramps, headaches and vomiting, and somewhat contradictorily, constipation or diarrhea. Today, vaccines and other medical interventions are very effective, but in the 1890s and 1900s, the only major treatments were consumption of tonics such as turpentine and quinine, which were utilized for intestinal disorders. Approximately 10% of those who contracted the illness died in turn of the century New York. In the late 19th and early 20th century, typhoid was a major public health issue in major cities such as New York, as it often spread through contaminated public water. This would only cease with the introduction of water chlorination and other forms of sterilization in the 1900s and 1910s. At the time Mallon contracted the disease, it was still a widespread problem, particularly so as many people who contracted typhoid are asymptomatic, meaning they can spread the disease but are not afflicted by it themselves in any severe fashion. People involved in food delivery and production could act as super spreaders of the malady. For instance, in 1899, a Boston milkman was responsible for spreading the disease to dozens of people whose homes he delivered milk to every day. What was especially difficult about this phenomenon was that the idea of asymptomatic carriers of disease was practically unknown of in the 1890s and 1900s. Mallon would become the first major case of this, and as such, she has her own place in the history of epidemiology. Mallon had evidently contracted typhoid at some stage in the late 1890s or the year 1900. It is not clear at all how or when she did so, but what is evident is that she must have had the disease by mid-1900, as she subsequently infected several members of a household in which she was working as a cook in Mamaroneck in Westchester County in New York at this time. These would appear to have been the first people she spread her illness to. Mallon's typhoid fever was likely a mild version, which resulted in little or no symptoms in Mary herself. As a result of this lack of any tangible signs of sickness, she never accepted herself that she had or was spreading a major bacterial illness. This refusal to accept the scientific basis of her illness went on for years, and explains why she continued to seek employment as a cook in the homes of many New York families long after she had been made aware that she was acting as a super spreader of the disease. Mallon spent the next 6 years working in various New York households, most in Manhattan, during which time she spread her typhoid to dozens of people. For instance, in 1901, she was employed in the household of a Manhattan-based lawyer, and 7 of the 8 residents became ill, at which point Mallon left their employ. In 1904, her activities were nearly discovered for the first time, when she began a period of employment in the house of another New York lawyer by the name of Henry Gilsey. Within a week or so, the laundress in the house became ill, and then 4 of the other 7 servants in the house also contracted typhoid from her and ended up sick. An investigation was launched by health inspectors at the time, but these mistakenly determined that the infection had started with a laundress, who had brought it into the household. Mallon's role in the illness which followed in her wake was finally identified in the early autumn of 1906, while she was employed in the summer residence of a New York banker on Long Island, called Charles Henry Warren. Health inspectors were called in after 6 members of the household became ill with typhoid fever within a space of a week of each other. This alone did not result in Mary's identification as the culprit, but the outbreak on Long Island did bring George Soper, an epidemiological investigator, into the picture. Soper was acquainted with the latest medical literature, which hypothesized that disease outbreaks of this kind could be the result of a silent, asymptomatic carrier. Soper soon suspected Mary of being the individual who had introduced the disease into the household in Long Island. As a result, he undertook a protracted investigation during which he began contacting Mallon's previous employees over the years prior to her going to work for Warren. Through this detective work, Soper determined that there had been outbreaks of typhoid in at least 7 houses where Mary had worked since 1900, and that these outbreaks had resulted in at least 22 instances of typhoid and 1 death. Armed with this information, Soper showed up unsolicited to the Park Avenue townhouse where Mary was working in March 1907. There he confronted her, stating that she was making people ill through her cookery, and that she was an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever, which she had spread around New York for years. He also requested samples of her blood and urine to run laboratory experiments to confirm his hypothesis. It is unclear to what extent Mallon might have known that she was responsible for the spread of illness that seemed to follow her in her wake at this point, but if she did know, she refused to take any responsibility and instead chased Soper out of the house. The matter did not rest there. Soper convinced the city health officials and then the police to have Mary tested. As a result, after refusing further offers to undertake voluntary tests, she was apprehended by police and detained in a New York hospital. Laboratory tests undertaken there determined that she was a silent, intermittent carrier of the bacterium involved in typhoid, and that she had been transmitting the same through unwashed hands during food preparation for years. Mary was removed to Riverside Isolation Hospital in the East River, where she was now treated with various therapies in the weeks that followed, all of which would now be understood to have been completely ineffective. Here she lived alone in isolation in a one-room cottage on the grounds. She would spend well over a year here, petitioning for her release. Mary Mallon would have remained an only vaguely well-known figure in American life, had it not been for events subsequent to her first arrest and enforced quarantine. In the summer of 1909, her case came dramatically to public attention through a story in the New York American, which detailed her release from detention and the fact that authorities were now considering rearresting her, as Mallon continued to pose a risk to public health, as she had continued to return to the kitchens of some of New York's wealthier households even after her first arrest and release. Soon the media was running one story after another about Typhoid Mary. In February 1910, Mary was released from quarantine for the second time after agreeing with authorities that she would change her occupation so that she no longer had anything to do with food preparation and would be consistent in her hygiene precautions. However, when Mallon was forced to take a job in a New York laundry, which was more physically demanding and offered lower wages than her former work as a cook, she abandoned this earlier commitment and by late 1912 was once again working as a cook in breach of the earlier agreement. In March 1915, the authorities discovered that Mallon was working in the kitchen of Sloan Maternity Hospital under a fake name. There had recently been an outbreak of typhoid fever linked to the hospital's kitchen, one which had resulted in at least 25 infections and 2 deaths. When the source of the outbreak was determined, Typhoid Mary once again became the subject of massive media scrutiny in New York and wider afield. On this occasion, her punishment was especially brutal. Mallon was returned to Riverside Quarantine Center just a few weeks later, and on this occasion, she would never be released. She spent the remaining 23 years of her life living alone in the small cottage she had been provided on the grounds, having contact only with other inmates and some staff. From 1918 onwards, she was allowed to work in the lab there, and was also permitted to take day trips where she left the island under supervision as long as she did not interact with people. In 1932, she suffered a stroke in her mid-60s, one which left her bedridden until her eventual death in November 1938 at the age of 69. It's likely that the reason Typhoid Mary was treated so harshly by the authorities, despite being just one of the thousands of asymptomatic typhoid carriers who resisted the authorities' efforts to restrict their activities, was because she spread the disease to some of New York's richest people, and because there was an immense anti-Irish sentiment still prevalent in America in the early 20th century. Thank you everyone for watching this video on Typhoid Mary. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments. If you have any suggestions, also leave them in the comments. And I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. That's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.